Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here once again for the next part of my reading of the lectures concerning the fourth way by Theodore and his sister, Theodore Nottingham and his sister or wife or whoever it is that he wrote this with. This next part is about multiple selves. We are not one person. There is no I am, but many I's coming from numerous places within us. There is the I who is in command when it is hungry. There is the I who is in a bad mood. There is the I that loves to read poetry, and on and on. This work enables us to look at this phenomenon while it is happening. In the state of sleep, we just assume that we always act as the same person. Inner knowledge tells us that we are made up of many disconnected, fragmentary facets without unity. When such information is verified, then a presence besides those many I's is also present. You can no longer fall entirely for the illusion of unity. A person beats his inner child in a moment of rage. In that instant, he is only adrenaline and anger. Hopefully, sometime later, another part of him is going to be horrified. But it could also happen that in the moment of explosion, something in him could have seen it coming and chosen not to let it take over. I will not go with that. That is not me. I do not need to do that. This effort leads to a disentanglement from a life of mechanism that leads us nowhere. One of the other great ideas of this work is that who we are attracts our life to us. If we are always unpleasant to be around, we will end up being by ourselves. We will gather to us a certain kind of life and people. It is no small thing to begin to see who we are. It will impact our whole life. We are not one, but many. The aim is to become one, the true one behind the many eyes. The mysterious metaphor, man is legion, refers to the multifaceted being that we are in our separation from the unifying source. Part of our inner work, then, is to develop an awareness of the feeling of I in that moment. Such an effort will allow us to not be that fragmentary self claiming to be our whole identity. Any change in the sense of I will also transform the world around us. If the person who is about to strike his child catches himself and recovers some patience or forgiveness, he or she is going to change their world. The child will grow up without carrying the violence into another generation. We generally encounter the world as an egotistical bundle of personal reactions, and that is the cause of so much of our unnecessary happiness. We must develop a feeling of I that is different from the one we have now. We all have the experience of constant chatter in our heads. We're always thinking something, responding to something, imagining something. We say I to each activity in our mind. I hate this. I am this. I want this. But this flood of constant response and talk in our brain is nothing more than life acting on our personality and our personality responding to it. We can form in ourselves, in our own psychology, a little bit of awareness that can stand back from that torrent of thought and activity and simply see without response to it, without judgment or justification. This seeing also allows us to recognize in that one moment we are this I. Yesterday we were another I. life impacts us and our personality responds. That little bit of observing I within us will grow and become more powerful. Eventually, it will lead to our true I, where we'll have the power to be more than merely reactions. No single I in our personality will include the whole of itself in our consciousness. The I that we are now cannot possibly contain all of who we are. The work tells us that what we are not conscious of will control us. When we are completely caught up in our ordinary sense of self, there is no chance of change. We are convinced that we are right. We take for granted that this is who we are. We don't create that inner space which allows a new evolution to take place. So long as we take ourselves as one person, we cannot move from where we are. There are sets of I's that are contradictory to the ones that make you feel bad. You can say yes to them and no to the ones that make you feel bad. As you begin to distance yourself from this inner ocean, you will be able to observe parts of yourself that we are calling I's, which are not only contradictory, but entirely foreign to what you really care about. For instance, you can be a religious person as well as the very opposite. In order to strengthen the part of yourself that wants to be a spiritual person over and against the part that couldn't care less, one has to intentionally give power to those I's that will do the work of spiritual evolution and remove power from those that will not. This requires serious personal separation. As things are now, all of these I's claim to be yourself whenever they appear. When you make that space, which is the detachment of the mystic, and you see these armies of light and darkness inside, then you know where the battle must take place. You will also see that the army of darkness is much bigger than the one of light. Those eyes that wish to love God and the universe and transcend their selfishness. Over and against them is this horde of barbarians that are only interested in being comfortable and satisfying their desires. We say I to everything. Everything that comes along makes us feel something. We say I to it. A lot of I's are extremely contradictory to one another. Those I's don't know each other very well. We are changing I's at every moment, every event, every thought, every feeling is a different I in us. They all belong to personality which is acquired over our lifetime. If we can see these I's as separate from our true self, if we do not give them our force for just a moment, that energy goes into true I and gives it more strength. Everyone has I's that they don't like in themselves. Cruel I's, lascivious I's. I don't want to think of ourselves. We don't want to think of ourselves as that kind of person. So when we have that I, we don't acknowledge it. If we see it at all, we justify it. Well, they deserved it. Most often, we don't see it at all. It comes and goes, and another I takes its place. An I happens to you because a set of circumstances in the external or internal world provokes that I. If we can see that it just happens, if we can separate and not say I to them and just refer to them as passing I's, we begin to detach from all the emotional bondage that these I's inflict upon our lives. The work tells us that nothing can change in us if we identify with all our I's. The whole point is to discover that we are not all that inner traffic. This insight gives us independence from the external world. This is a fundamental aspect of spiritual maturity and freedom. If we look at the teachers of humanity, they were independent of the forces around them. They were truly themselves and able to act in the world regardless of surrounding influences. That is one characteristic of higher consciousness. We do not have to create any grief for ourselves as part of our spiritual awakening. Life will give us all the grief we can handle and a whole lot more. Going into a monastery or developing an intense discipline will not necessarily lead to authentic transformation. With this teaching, we are offered the mechanism of self-change. It is very specific, very scientific. This is spirituality brought to the West so that all of us who are bred through the use of the mind are able to access these higher states through knowledge. If we cannot see we are many and insist on regarding ourselves as one, then we could do nothing with regard to our inner life. Buffers are a psychological phenomenon that keeps one set of eyes from knowing each other. They allow you to live with all the contradictions because they are not seen. This is a fundamental characteristic of the state of waking sleep in which we live, wherein we cannot see the whole picture. Lower eyes cannot see higher eyes. How can we separate if we take everything as ourselves? Some eyes can make us depressed and have power over us. We do not even challenge them. We can detect their presence by a sudden loss of force. If we are not quick enough, they will take over. It is no use arguing with an unpleasant eye. All our work lies in separating from wrong eyes. Where do they come from? At birth, we have a certain nature called essence. Everything that happens to us from that point on lays down patterns of behavior, attitudes, and associations in thought. These eyes are not expressive of real I, but come from what has been built up in us through experience. This is determined by where we are born, when we are born. In a different culture, our eyes would be completely different. In the desert, you might have wonderful associations concerning rain, whereas in Seattle, it might depress you. They are all just eyes arising from personality, which is a conglomeration of acquired thoughts, attitudes, moods, and opinions. We don't have to take all of this as oneself. If we invest our energy by identifying with an I, we give it power. By observation, we can see that they change constantly. Eventually, we will be able to separate. What is separate from that stream of eyes? Real I. This is important because the state of consciousness that we live in, characterized by multiplicity, is the reason why there is so much violence in our world. Everyone is identified. Everyone is asleep. Everyone has false ideas about themselves. All of the I's that arise out of personality come from self-interest. And self-interest is always in conflict with the world. If we have an I that says, I am an American, and therefore, as a good patriot, I must have an enemy who is not an American. Here is an example of why that state of consciousness is so dangerous. Everything is turned into conflict because we cannot find the place within that does not need to fight for its vanity or for those attitudes that keep us locked in. If all of that were unplugged and we were at peace, not easily offended, not aggressively competitive, we could go through life being goodness. This would be the result of struggling against the eyes. All of us, even nice people, have abhorrent thoughts. If we ascribe them to ourselves, We are in the power of that thought whether we act it out or not. We must not give it our energy and say I to it, and it will pass. Those kind of negative I's will come in cycles. If we keep refusing to allow our emotions to get attached to them, identification, we will recognize that it isn't I, but that it comes and goes. We don't have to be that thought. In order to protect our inner being from negative events, we must become hermetically sealed. They cannot penetrate to the core of ourselves and pollute us. It is possible to keep a part of ourselves protected. The idea of selection allows us to choose which thoughts to go with. Get thee behind me, Satan. This is inner spiritual warfare. Satan is the conglomeration of all those results of the sleeping human psychology that creates the distorted human beings, the selfishness, the violence, the chaos within. Initial methods. Self-observation. Self-observation is the first tool in the process of awakening. The application of any of these ideas begins with self-observation. This is an act of attention directed inward towards what is going on in us. Instead of living on the exterior, there is little attention and energy kept within that can remain neutral and observe our behavior. Most of the time, we are so unaware of ourselves that we don't even realize how we are sitting or what our posture is like. We are completely asleep to ourselves. This self-observation begins to let a ray of light into our inner darkness, but it cannot be done automatically like everything else we do. It requires a conscious effort. We must develop some control over our energy. If it is all used up for other things, we will not have it available for this effort. The work requires the valuation of attention and energy. The idea of higher states of consciousness is a more intensive way of being alive. In such states, there is a presence that resonates in the now. But we leak out our energy every day so completely and in so many ways that we do not have the fuel to live those higher states, which would so thoroughly change our lives. Self-observation means that we see something recurring in ourselves. The more we see it, the less we are under its power. If we see something in ourselves, such as lying, the natural inclination is to feel horrified. As long as we stay in that condition of response to what we have observed, we have no power to separate ourselves from it. However, the non-judgmental observing eye will naturally begin to change our way of acting in the world. It will also lead us to forgiveness, humility, and compassion, not only for yourself, but for everyone else. When we come into the world, we are like a blank tape. Everything that we experience after our birth builds our personality. All of the external situations in our life interact with our essence, and that creates who we are on the surface. This self is not the true I, but the I of personality, which stands on shifting sand. The work leads us to our real self, from which we can act rightly in the world. The consequences of this work are joyful and liberating. Self-observation leads to inner separation, which is the beginning of the possibility of awakening. But it must be done in a neutral fashion. Usually, when we see something in ourselves, we either deny it or feel horrible about ourselves, or we justify it. It only happened this one time. I'm not like that. This scientific psychological method allows you to see within yourself in a way that you have never seen before. The object of self-observation is to impartially, uncritically, and without justifying, take an inner glance at yourself, your attitudes and your behavior. Try not to have an emotional response to what you see. This creates separation within yourself between the changing eyes that you're observing and something within you that is stable and real. In the beginning, it is weak. This is your true I, your higher self, and self-observation will strengthen a sense of real I. It will make a space between the turning wheels of I that go through you all day and the part of you that is your innermost, truest self, which is most closely linked to the source of our being, which is unfathomable. We say I to everything. Everything that comes along makes us feel something. We say I to it. A lot of our eyes are extremely contradictory to one another. Those eyes don't know each other. We are changing eyes at every moment, every event, every thought, every feeling is a different I in us. They all belong to personality, which is acquired over our lifetime. If we do not give them our force for just a moment, that energy goes into true I and gives it more strength. Everyone has eyes that they don't like inside themselves. Cruel eyes, lascivious eyes. We don't want to think of ourselves as that kind of person. So when we have that I, we don't acknowledge it. If we see it at all, we justify it. Well, they deserve that. Most often, we don't see it at all. It comes and goes, and another I takes its place. An I happens to you because a set of circumstances in the external or internal world provokes that I. If we can see that it just happens, if we can separate and not say I to them and just refer to them as passing eyes, we begin to detach from all of the emotional bondage that these eyes inflict upon our lives. We are told in the work that nothing can change in us if we identify with all our eyes. The whole point is to discover that we are not that traffic, wherever it comes from. That gives us independence from the external world. That is spiritual maturity and freedom. If you look at the sages of humanity, they were independent of the things that came at them, and were therefore truly themselves and able to act in the world regardless of the circumstances. One of the tricks in self-observation is to not call eyes I. When you observe yourself in a negative state, you say to yourself, I'm in a negative state. I'm really angry. Someone did something that upset me. This is seeing, not observing. Observing says, it is in a negative state. It feels angry. It feels resentment. What we are dealing with is a phenomenon that is separate from us. If we can observe our mechanical behavior and not call it I, we will be able to separate from it and not have to respond automatically to it. Calling these inner disturbances it can help. If we find difficult and confusing this concept of many eyes and the idea that our moods and our feelings and our attitudes are not us, but simply our acquired behavior, then calling our mechanical self it instead of I can help us learn to separate. In meditation, it is possible to reach a peaceful place within and feel refreshed and vitally alive. But then we step into the street and suddenly we are back in the whirlwind again. Here is the practical way, the secret to learning how not to fall right back into it, and therefore to maintain that higher state of serenity in the midst of chaos that we know so well. This work allows us to notice who are the friends and who are the enemies within us. As it is now, they are all the same, since they can each claim power anytime they want. There is no control, no direction, no center of gravity, where one is anchored in certain fundamental decisions about the direction of one's life and commitments. When we begin to make an inner separation within ourselves and create observing I, we are separating a part of our psychology from the mechanical part of our personality that is continually interacting with the world. That makes the personality that is functioning in the world self-conscious, because it is being observed. This takes some of the force out of the strength of feeling ourselves as that personality, because now there is something else in us that feels more like us than the personality. It is no longer self-assured. Something within us is seeing our life from a perspective that is not identified, and therefore it isn't caught up in the power of the daily emotional roller coaster. The personality loses strength when it begins to be observed. If practiced with sincerity, the real I that would choose to live in accordance with our fate, our destiny, our vocation, our purpose for being here, would act in the world rightly. As the real I gains in strength, you begin to change. Gradually, the personality becomes a servant to that real I. Instead of acting out of control with no unity, it will act with real will and express your unique individuality in the way that it is meant to be expressed. The work says that personality is all that is built up within us from a young age. This needs to happen so that we know how to function in the world. So we move from essence, what we are born with, into personality, which is artificially absorbed through the culture and education, but is necessary in order to deal with the world. Inner work makes this personality more passive, so that arrogance, pride, and all of the other attributes of personality lose power. When Dorothy pulls the curtain back on the Wizard of Oz and catches the little man working the equipment, the power of the mighty Oz is forfeited. That is very much the idea of catching personality for what it is. We become very vulnerable because we no longer have that puffed up behavior made out of sound and fury signifying nothing. When you finally begin to activate that group of I's that wants to live at a higher level, you will soon find yourself confronted by the opposite I's. That powerful group that wants to stay in control, yet doesn't want anything to do with this self-transcendence business. Your greatest enemy is the false part of you that will not relinquish its power and will seek to destroy the other part of you that seeks the spiritual life. The early fathers of Christianity saw the demonic as psychological phenomena. They talked about this teaching on I's as demons. A demon enters and suggests such and such an act to you, and you have a choice. Assent to the suggestion or reject it. In some ways, the ancient metaphors make it easier to fight internal contradictions than the terminology of the work. If you know you are dealing with evil, you can face off with it. When it is confused with yourself, or what you thought of yourself, it is more subtle and complex. These ideas must be employed in your everyday dealings. To be in the world and yet to be removed from it is real work. In order to accomplish this, you must find time for yourself and seek quiet space. Take 20 minutes a day for the centering that will give you the inner force to build up your true self. Again, this is why the work has been referred to as that of the cunning man, because we are to take the events of life, the nasty boss, the frantic pace, and turn them into inner gold by using them as opportunities to reach that objective space that can deal with both one's inner and outer world. When the work is applied to challenges in the outer world, it defines and gives character and strength to your real I. From this perspective, we can be sharpened every day. John of the Cross refers to the rock being sculpted. It doesn't know that it is being turned into a piece of art. It only knows that it is being hammered on. As we enter deeper into this teaching, we begin to feel sustained by the power behind these ideas. The world is to come under influences that are from a higher realm. There are the influences of life, making a living and so forth, and there are higher spiritual influences that come down through real I, through essence, through level of being, that have to do with the presence of God. These influences can sustain us through everything, including death. This work cleanses, aligns, and puts us in connection with something that is far beyond our own means, so that we are not left out there by ourselves, flailing against our enemies. Ultimately, there is the hope of being in touch with something that can give us the kind of support that we cannot give ourselves. All our work lies in separating from the wrong eyes. In the beginning, we cannot even tell the difference between the right and wrong eyes, since we have no guidelines. Behind all our many desires is the one desire for God. These finite desires are merely reflections of the ultimate desire for the infinite. We must therefore center our lives around making a choice, coming to a decision. We must unify ourselves around a focal point, a decision, which the work defines as separating from the wrong eyes. We need to sort out the wheat from the tares. What drags us down is our choice. We have the power of choice to think in one way or another. The I that decides to wake up early is not the same I that has to roll out of bed at 5:30 when the alarm goes off. You can notice in your contradictions that one I is in charge and that it doesn't remember the previous one. When you sit down to dinner, you often don't remember your diet eyes. They don't appear until you're finished. The fact that one can recognize that this is what I wanted to do and this is what I did can be the beginning of seeing clues to a complete transformation of consciousness. Ideally, we should go through life in that higher place that is detached, free, self-controlled, and able to do right action in the world. This place does not get dragged down by boredom, depression, and envy. This is the place that can be reached briefly in meditation and can become the place inside you which is the observer. After a beautiful meditation or worship service, or having listened to a piece of music, you will notice that 15 minutes later you are under attack and your higher state is lost. You are back in the usual momentum. You must begin to build slowly, carrying that meditative inner space into the madness of daily life. In this work, you need to remember that you don't remember yourself. In other words, an hour into the day, after having started out quietly and built that inner space, you suddenly realize that you've completely forgotten about it. That is an important moment. Merely noticing how you completely lost track of what you are trying to be and do is the beginning of change. All of these steps and ideas lead somewhere. They lead to a definite change, a definite transformation of your being. If your aim is to be in touch with God, or to have enough knowledge of God to know what your place is in the world, what you are supposed to do while you are here, and the meaning of your existence, there must first be an emptiness created within. This work is all about clearing out the mess that is inside everyone as a consequence of being born on this planet. In order to get behind that noise and become able to hear guidance from another source. So all the things that we are talking about, many eyes, self-observation, inner separation, are tools. They are meant to clear a path in you that will be without self-interest, and consequently will be at the service of what is divine in the world. This work can lead you to a very great place in yourself, which is your highest fulfillment. Gurdjieff said not to take any of these ideas on faith. The only value is to verify it for yourself. The only way you can find out what it might do for you is to begin with inner separation. The key to get the inner separation that can remove us from the hypnosis of the external world is self-observation. This is the secret of the work. This teaching uses our daily life as the food for our transformation. This methodology begins with self-observation. Self-observation leads to inner separation, which is the beginning of the possibility of awakening, but it must be done in a neutral fashion. We are told in the work that nothing can change in us if we identify with all our eyes. The whole point is to discover that we are not all that traffic wherever it comes from. That gives us independence from the external world. This is spiritual maturity and freedom. In this teaching, morality is subject to a great extent. What is moral for this time was not moral 100 years ago. What is moral in this country is not moral someplace else. The vast majority of the things to which we assign morality are subjective. That morality can change according to the person, the place, the era, the culture. This condition of self-observation cannot assign judgment, because as soon as we do, we are no longer observing, but we are being it. If we are being it, we have no chance of separating from it. So if we observe something in ourselves, such as a hateful eye, and we feel that we don't want to be that, we are investing in it with our emotional energy, and we will not be able to separate ourselves from it. Eventually, through a long process of self-observation with non-judgment, we can see which eyes serve a higher purpose, goodness, and which do not serve it. When we can be separate from it, we can pull ourselves out of the eyes that don't serve higher consciousness, and consequently they become weak. That is how we can have an influence on them. This idea of selecting parts of oneself is very important. Being able to be objective with oneself enough to see that there is a large crowd within us allows us to see those parts of us that have no interest in spirituality. Now, we are capable of recognizing the enemy. The few eyes that are interested in self-transcendence are the ones we want to cultivate. As they get stronger, they will help us to evolve to that higher quality of being. But until we get to this point, seeing the contradictions within, everything remains confused and chaotic. These ideas will step on your toes, but if we apply the humility of observation, we will develop marvelous insights into how this mechanism operates. We touch life according to implanted attitudes, wrote Maurice Nicole. It is an extraordinary experience to become even a little free from this acquired way of taking life and taking others. With insight into oneself, it is possible to take things in a new way. Change involves a change in oneself. We are all convinced that the way we take things is appropriate. The work is meant to dissolve self-complacency, this pseudo-creation we call ourselves. We are slaves to this acquired machinery that we take as ourselves. The practice of the work allows us to capture overviews of what we are really like and what we have been like for years. This can certainly be shattering, but it is dangerous unless we know how not to become negative as a result of these perceptions. We cannot take all our eyes as ourselves, and the work calls this conglomeration as imaginary I. Nicole asked the question, is not all development through a process of rejection and selection? It follows that we must wonder how we can reject or select if all is one for us, if all is I. The object of this work is to make us conscious of what is going on in us. Here in this inner world, and in what we select and reject in it, lies the key to the work and so to evolution. Just remembering that we forgot to remember is an important observation. To say, I'm going to observe my impatience. Suddenly it's Friday and I've been impatient all week but never thought about noticing it, reveals to us very clearly what the idea of sleep is about. There is a dimension of observing I that needs to break through to a larger perspective that has healing powers. One of the problems with the way the work is being taught, as we experienced it, and as Gurdjieff saw it being done in New York to his great disgust, is the fact that it is often reduced to a sterile psychological exercise. Even though one has to make simple efforts in the beginning, baby steps even, the whole point is that we are embarking on the greatest adventure human beings can undertake, which is to connect with that holy dimension of life, that unnameable dimension that we come from, and which transcends even our passage through this plane. Observing I, seeing tensions in the body, has the potential of doing more than merely alerting us to it. Observing I can also link you with a spiritual quality of self-forgetfulness. You remember yourself in order to forget yourself. The quality of transcendence of self is such that there is a meltdown of tension. Observing I needs to eventually remove us from the sphere of self-concern to the point where all our wrong tensions and attitudes disappear, just like in deep meditation. Such relaxation of misguided tension can come to us through a moment of higher emotional experience that becomes available through the moment of separation. We must be aware of turning this kind of observation into microscopic self-absorption, all turned in upon ourselves. Remember that ultimately the aim is to be so surrendered to the something higher that we are, that we both vanish and find self-realization. Tension comes from something emotional. If we can take the emotion out of an anxiety, then the physiology can relax. The power of observation is that it teaches us that we are not fully captives of our behavior. Becoming aware of tensions begins the process of relaxing it. The process of relaxing tense muscles is directly related to our spiritual state in the moment. Awareness becomes healing and frees us to simply be in the moment. We can only have that inner liberation by a separation. Detachment or inner separation is the key. The work does not give us platitudes, but practical how-to insights. To remember some of these ideas during the current of the daily activities is to notice something about yourself. That noticing is the first step towards awakening, which is a way of being in the world that is closer to our true potential. So there we go, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to wrap it up there at 45 minutes. And the next section is about negativity. And I will bring that to you as soon as I possibly can. Thank you very much for listening. Peace.